The transport pod hissed open, releasing a puff of sterilized air into the equally sterile arrival bay. Kale stepped out, inhaling the metallic tang that permeated Zoratha's atmosphere. He shouldered his duffel bag and looked around at the geometric precision of the terminal, all sharp angles, seamless transitions, and not a single decorative element in sight. "Welcome to Planet Efficient," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his perpetually messy brown hair. A blue-skinned official approached, tablet in hand, eyes scanning Kale with mechanical efficiency. "Engineer Kale of Earth, identification confirmed. Your punctuality is noted and appreciated." The official didn't extend a hand or even nod, such gestures were considered wasteful on Zorath. "Just Kale is fine," he said, flashing a smile that the official didn't return. "And thanks. I tried to be on time." Interplanetary travel makes a better first impression than saying, "Sorry I'm late, my shuttle got eaten by a space whale." The official's expression didn't flicker. Humor without practical purpose is discouraged in public spaces. "Your assigned quarters are in Residential Sector 9, Unit 23C. Your work assignment begins at Planetary Cycle 1. 2 tomorrow. Do you require nutritional sustenance?" Kale fought the urge to roll his eyes. "I'm good, thanks. Had some nutritional sustenance on the shuttle." "Very well. Follow illuminated pathway 19D to your accommodations." Kale trudged down the indicated path, passing dozens of blue-skinned Zorathians going about their business with synchronized precision. Nobody was chatting, nobody was laughing, nobody was even looking around. They moved with purpose and nothing else, like components in an enormous machine. His quarters turned out to be a minimalist box, a bed, a workstation, storage compartments, and a sanitation unit. Kale tossed his bag onto the bed and pulled out a crumpled NASA t-shirt, shaking it out before hanging it prominently in the storage unit. "At least it adds a splash of color to the monochromatic space," he said. Home sweet sterile box. The central energy facility of Zoratha's capital city loomed like a massive crystalline structure, power conduits and energy pathways visible through transparent sections of its walls. Kale whistled as he made his way through the security checkpoints, earning disapproving glances from the facility staff. His supervisor, a tall Zorathian named Vryn, met him at the primary control hub. "Engineer Kale, your punctuality is appreciated." "Second time I've heard that since I landed," Kale replied. "You guys must really have a thing for watches." Vryn's face remained impassive. "Time efficiency is fundamental to Zorathian progress. Your assignment is to upgrade the quantum fluctuation stabilizers in Sector 14. Tools have been prepared according to Earth standard specifications." "Sweet. Point me to the coffee station first, and I'll get right on it." Vryn tilted his head slightly. "There is no coffee station. Stimulants are distributed only at designated nutrition intervals." "You're kidding, right?" Kale groaned. "How does anyone function without coffee breaks?" "We function with optimal efficiency because we are not constantly interrupting our work for unnecessary consumption." Kale shook his head. All right. Sector 14 it is." 3 hours into his shift, Kale sat cross-legged on the floor of a maintenance junction, singing Rocket Man under his breath while recalibrating a particularly stubborn power regulator. "Come on, baby, don't fight me on this," he said to the machine, tapping its casing affectionately. "We both know you'll feel better after the upgrade. Why are you speaking to the equipment?" Kale jumped, nearly dropping his calibration tool. A female Zorathian stood watching him with an expression that wasn't quite the blank mask he'd seen on everyone else. She wore the distinctive sapphire-trimmed uniform of a high-ranking official, and intricate silver markings traced patterns across her shoulders and upper neck. He scrambled to his feet. "Just a little Earth tradition. We talk to machines sometimes. Helps with the troubleshooting." "How can verbal communication assist with non-sentient technology?" she asked, head tilted slightly. Kale shrugged. "Honestly, no idea. But when you call a stubborn engine a worthless piece of junk, it usually starts working again out of spite. Her brow furrowed. Machines cannot experience spite. That's exactly what they want you to think, Kale grinned, then caught himself. Sorry. More useless Earth humor. I'm Kale, Energy System Specialist. I am Zanara of High Counselor VRNN, she said, studying him with startling sapphire eyes. I am conducting facility inspections as part of my diplomatic training. Kale noticed, despite his efforts not to, that Zanara was stunning by any planet standards, athletic build, perfect posture, and features that somehow managed to be both striking and delicate. He quickly averted his gaze, remembering the briefing about Zorathian attitudes toward physical appreciation. Well, don't let me keep you from your inspection, Kale said, turning back to the regulator. Though fair warning, I've made unauthorized modifications to this junction. Unauthorized modifications are prohibited, Zanara stated, moving closer. What have you done? I added efficiency parameters that weren't in the specs, Kale explained, pointing to the regulator's display. See those numbers? Your system was wasting about 3% energy through heat dispersion. I tweaked the superconductor alignment to recapture it. Zanara leaned in, studying the readings with surprising intensity. This is not standard procedure. Standard procedure isn't always the most efficient, Kale said, surprised to find himself using Zorathian logic. Earth engineers are taught to improvise. Improvisation introduces variables and potential failure points, Zanara countered, but her voice lacked conviction. Sometimes those variables lead to breakthroughs. Kale resumed his work, reattaching the regulator's casing. Think of it as controlled evolution instead of chaotic improvisation. To his surprise, Zanara crouched beside him, watching his hands work. Your methodology is unusual, yet your results exceed expected parameters. That's basically my entire performance review history in one sentence, Kale laughed. Before Zanara could respond, a loud crack echoed through the junction, followed by a surge of blue electricity across the conduit above them. A power coupling had ruptured, shooting a deadly arc of energy directly toward where Zanara knelt. Kale didn't think, he moved. His arm shot out, grabbing Zanara and yanking her backward as the energy discharge scorched the floor where she'd been just milliseconds before. They tumbled backward together, Kale's arm still wrapped around her shoulders as the rogue electricity dissipated into the emergency grounding system. Alarm klaxons wailed, and emergency containment fields snapped into place around the damaged coupling. Are you okay? Kale asked, smiling with relief as he helped Zanara to her feet. She stared at his hand on her arm, then at his face, her expression unreadable. That manner of physical contact is highly inappropriate, she said stiffly, though something in her eyes suggested curiosity rather than offense. And your facial expression is unnecessarily expressive, Kale replied, releasing her arm but maintaining eye contact. On Earth, we call it a smile. You should try it sometime. Smiling without purpose is considered, let me guess, inefficient. Precisely. But Zanara's posture had changed subtly, her voice softening. However, your rapid response likely prevented serious injury. This raises questions about the value of spontaneous physical action in emergency scenarios. That's a very technical way of saying, thanks for saving me, Kale replied. Gratitude is implied in the acknowledgement of beneficial actions, Zanara stated. But then, almost imperceptibly, the corner of her mouth twitched. But yes, as you would say on Earth, thank you. Security personnel flooded the junction, followed by repair crews and administrators demanding reports. Kale and Zanara were separated, each questioned extensively about the malfunction. By the time Kale finished his incident report, Zanara was gone. Over the next week, Kale noticed Zanara appearing with increasingly transparent excuses to observe his work. First, it was routine inspection follow-ups, then integration protocol verification. By the fifth day, she wasn't even bothering with pretexts anymore. Your methodology for power grid synchronization is unorthodox, she commented, watching him bypass an unnecessary safety redundancy. That's a nice way of saying I'm breaking all your rules, Kale replied, not looking up from his work. If it helps, we have rules on Earth too. I break those as well. Yet your results consistently exceed efficiency projections, Zanara noted. This creates a logical inconsistency in our operational doctrine. Maybe your doctrine needs updating, Kale suggested, finishing the bypass. The power readings immediately stabilized, showing a 4.2% increase in throughput. Sometimes the rule book needs a rewrite. Zanara's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. That assertion would be considered borderline seditious in certain contexts. Good thing we're just talking about power grids, then, Kale winked. Later that same day, Kale found himself whistling while reconfiguring a junction box. To his surprise, he heard Zanara behind him, attempting to mimic the tune, badly. He turned to find her standing there, looking almost embarrassed. The vibration pattern you produce seems to correlate with increased work efficiency, she explained quickly. I was attempting to reproduce the effect. It's called whistling, Kale said. And it doesn't make me more efficient, it just makes boring work less boring. Boredom is a productivity impediment, Zanara reasoned, therefore, eliminating boredom increases productivity. Kale laughed, that's some Olympic-level mental gymnastics to justify trying something fun. Fun is not the objective, Zanara insisted, though her eyes betrayed her, optimization is the objective. Sure it is, Kale nodded, playing along, just like I talk to machines for troubleshooting purposes and not because it amuses me. The next day, Kale caught Zanara whispering to a diagnostic terminal when she thought no one was watching. 2 weeks into his assignment, Kale was making his usual unauthorized coffee substitute in a maintenance closet he'd converted into an improvised break room. He'd rigged a heating element to warm reconstituted earth coffee powder he'd smuggled in his personal effects. The resulting brew was terrible, but it was better than nothing. The door slid open and Kale froze, cup in hand, expecting VRYN or another supervisor. Instead, Zanara stood there, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. This is clearly an unauthorized utilization of maintenance resources, she stated. Busted, Kale said. In my defense, I'm 62% more productive with caffeine. I have not reported this violation, Zanara said, stepping inside and letting the door close behind her. Nor do I intend to. Kale raised an eyebrow. Withholding information from authorities? That doesn't seem very Zorathian of you. I find myself increasingly conflicted regarding certain regulatory standards, Zanara admitted. Your presence has introduced inconsistencies in my established thought patterns. I tend to have that effect on people, Kale grinned, offering her the cup. Want to try it? Fair warning, it's terrible. Zanara eyed the cup suspiciously. Consuming non-approved substances is, let me guess, inefficient and potentially hazardous. Correct. It's just coffee. Humans have been drinking it for centuries. We're still around. After a moment's hesitation, she accepted the cup and took a cautious sip. Her face contorted in what Kale could only describe as confused disgust. This is extraordinarily bitter, she managed, handing the cup back. Yeah, good coffee didn't make it into the diplomatic exchange program budget, Kale laughed. But it's still better than no coffee. The concept of consuming an unpleasant substance for its secondary effects is peculiar, Zanara said. Yet I find myself curious about other Earth customs that might appear equally inefficient at first assessment. Kale studied her face, realizing what she was awkwardly trying to say. Zanara, are you asking me to show you how Earth people do things? I believe a comparative cultural study would be educationally valuable, she said formally, then added with startling directness, your behaviors are inefficiently fascinating, Kale. Would you be willing to provide a private educational demonstration of Earth customs? For diplomatic purposes, of course. Kale nearly choked on his coffee. Coming from a Zorathian, especially one of Zanara's status, this request bordered on scandalous. Yet her eyes held genuine curiosity, and something else he couldn't quite name. I'd be happy to launch a cultural exchange program, Kale replied with a slow smile. For diplomatic purposes, naturally. Excellent, Zanara said, with the faintest hint of what might almost be called excitement in her voice. Shall we begin tomorrow after standard operational hours? My quarters in the diplomatic residential sector would provide appropriate privacy for such educational activities. Kale couldn't help but laugh at her phrasing, which on Earth would have sounded decidedly suggestive. It's a date, he said, then quickly corrected himself. I mean, it's an appointment. A diplomatic appointment. I shall prepare accordingly, Zanara nodded, turning to leave. At the door, she paused. And Kale, your smile. It is not entirely inefficient. It appears to serve some function I have yet to fully comprehend. With that enigmatic statement, she was gone, leaving Kale staring after her, wondering exactly what he'd gotten himself into. The next day, Kale spent his entire shift oscillating between anticipation and dread. What exactly did cultural education entail when the student was a high-ranking Zorathian from a society that viewed pleasure as inefficient? He'd already violated at least a dozen Zorathian protocols just by inviting her to his quarters. If anyone discovered their planned meeting, the consequences could be severe. You're overthinking this, Kale, he muttered to himself while recalibrating a power relay. It's just cultural exchange. Totally legitimate. Completely professional. By the time his shift ended, Kale had transformed his sterile quarters into something resembling a human habitat. He'd unpacked all his Earth contraband, string lights that now draped across the ceiling, vintage band posters, Arctic Monkeys, Radiohead, and his guilty pleasure, Taylor Swift's 50th anniversary tour, a small sound system, and various knickknacks that made the space distinctly un-Zorathian. When his door chimed precisely at the agreed time, Kale's heart raced like he was 16 again, waiting for his prom date. Zanara stood in the corridor, glancing nervously over her shoulder before entering. She wore standard Zorathian attire, a minimalist tunic in subdued blue, but had removed the formal insignias of her rank. I have informed my security detail that I am conducting independent research at the Central Archives, she explained. We have approximately 3 standard hours before my absence becomes questionable. 3 hours to introduce you to fun, Kale nodded. Challenge accepted. Zanara surveyed the transformed room, her sapphire eyes widening. Your living space is chaotic. Welcome to Earth Embassy Unofficial, Kale announced, gesturing grandly to his humble room. Where fun isn't just allowed, it's encouraged. Zanara approached a poster, studying it with scientific intensity. These humans are holding primitive amplification devices, and their facial expressions suggest either intense pain or significant emotional distress. That's Arctic Monkeys in concert, Kale laughed. And those expressions mean they're really into the music they're playing. Music, Zanara repeated the word as if testing its weight. Zorath has sonic alignment tones for work productivity, but I understand Earth music serves no practical function. That's where you're wrong, Kale said, activating his sound system. Music's function is to make you feel something. He started with classical. Debussy's Clair de Lune filled the room with gentle piano notes. Zanara stood motionless, her eyes gradually softening as the melody progressed. The mathematical precision is acceptable, she conceded. There appears to be a logical progression to the tonal variations. Kale switched to jazz next, Miles Davis's So What. The walking bassline and loose structure clearly puzzled Zanara, but halfway through the track, Kale noticed her right foot tapping slightly in rhythm. She followed his gaze downward and froze, staring at her foot with alarm. This rhythmic pattern is causing my body to respond without authorization, she said, looking genuinely disturbed. That's called feeling the beat, Kale explained, fighting back a grin. Completely harmless, except to your dignity if you have no rhythm. Is this a typical human physiological response? Zanara asked cautiously, allowing her foot to resume its tapping. Absolutely. Wait till you see this. Kale stood and began dancing, nothing complicated, just moving with the rhythm. Zenara's eyes widened in horror. Are you experiencing a seizure? Should I summon medical assistance? This is dancing, Kale explained, continuing to move. It's how humans express enjoyment of music physically. On Zorath, such movements would be interpreted as either a mating display or signs of severe neurological distress, she explained seriously. On Earth, it's Saturday night at any club, Kale countered, extending his hand. Want to try? Zenara stared at his outstretched hand. Physical coordination for non-productive purposes is, she began, then surprised him by taking his hand. An interesting anthropological experiment. Kale guided her through basic movements, trying to ignore how her touch sent electricity through his fingers that had nothing to do with the facility's power systems. At first, Zenara moved with robotic precision, copying his movements exactly. You're thinking too much, Kale said. Dancing isn't about perfect execution, it's about feeling. Feeling is inefficient, Zenara responded automatically, but her movements gradually became less mechanical. That's it, Kale encouraged. Sometimes inefficiency is the whole point. After several songs, Kale showed her how to high-five. The first time their palms connected, Zenara jerked back as if shocked. That was unusual, she said, staring at her hand. A sensory response occurred that was not unpleasant. Just wait, Kale grinned. The night of human inefficiency is just getting started. Next came card games. Kale taught her poker, which Zenara mastered in minutes, calculating probabilities with frightening precision while insisting she was merely engaging in statistical analysis exercises. When Kale demonstrated simple magic tricks, making a coin disappear and reappear behind her ear, Zenara launched into a detailed scientific deconstruction of sleight-of-hand principles until Kale placed a finger gently against her lips. Sometimes the magic is in not knowing how it works, he said softly, withdrawing his finger when he realized how intimate the gesture was. Zenara fell silent, staring at him with an expression he couldn't decipher. I have a confession, she finally said. Before meeting you, I had accessed restricted Earth cultural files. I was curious. You're a rebel underneath all that Zorathian efficiency, aren't you? Kale smirked. Perhaps, she admitted. My position grants me access to historical archives most citizens never see. Did you know Zorath wasn't always this way? 3 centuries ago, before the Great Rationalization, our society celebrated collective experiences that appear similar to your fun. What happened? Kale asked. Resource scarcity led to the efficiency revolution, Zenara explained. Emotional expression was deemed wasteful. Personal pleasure was categorized as selfish resource allocation, her voice carried a hint of sadness. Within 2 generations, our ancient celebrations were forgotten. Kale considered this. That's pretty heavy stuff. I think we need to lighten the mood. He moved to a small device in the corner that he'd kept covered. What is that apparatus? Zenara asked, scientific curiosity returning. This, Kale said with theatrical flair, revealing a compact freezer unit, is humanity's greatest achievement. He produced 2 bowls and scooped what appeared to be white frozen substance into each. What is the purpose of this frozen substance? Zenara asked suspiciously. Just taste it, Kale encouraged, handing her a spoon. Zenara studied the ice cream like it might be radioactive, then took a minuscule amount on her spoon and cautiously placed it in her mouth. The transformation was immediate and electric. Her eyes widened to their fullest extent, her blue skin flushed a deeper sapphire hue, and then a sound escaped her that was something between a gasp and a moan, so primal and unrestrained that both of them froze in sudden awkward recognition of its intensity. That was. She stammered, uncharacteristically lost for words. Just wait till you try chocolate, Kale said with a wink, his collar suddenly feeling too tight. Zenara stared at the bowl, then took another spoonful, this time closing her eyes as she consumed it. The sensory experience is overwhelming, she whispered. How is this not standard practice throughout the galaxy? Some pleasures are worth traveling across space for, Kale replied, watching her enjoy each bite with growing fascination. Over the next 2 weeks, their cultural research sessions became frequent and increasingly daring. Each night, Zanara requested new Earth experiences. They watched comedy holograms that made her cover her mouth to suppress unauthorized laughter. They built a fort out of blankets, a completely impractical defensive structure, she noted, while clearly enjoying herself. They played Earth music loudly and danced with growing abandon. Kale taught her to high-five, fist bump, and eventually to hug. The first embrace lasted perhaps 2 seconds before Zanara pulled away, her skin flushed that deeper sapphire. Physical contact for non-medical or non-reproductive purposes is strictly forbidden, she whispered. Yet the neurological response is remarkable. Humans are tactile creatures, Kale explained. We need physical contact for emotional health. Perhaps Zorathians once did as well, Zanara mused. During one session, while explaining Earth social customs, Kale demonstrated a casual shoulder massage. The moment his fingers pressed into her tense muscles, Zanara made a sound that nearly stopped his heart, her body arching with such force she knocked over a nearby chair. She spun around, eyes wide. Is this what Earth humans do regularly? She asked breathlessly. For recreation. This is just the G-rated stuff, Kale joked, not realizing she wouldn't understand the reference. G-rated? She questioned. Never mind, Kale backpedaled. I just meant humans have lots of ways of experiencing physical pleasure that aren't about reproduction. Fascinating, Zanara murmured, her eyes never leaving his. Our historical archives suggest similar practices existed on Zorith before being classified as dangerously inefficient. Their meetings expanded beyond Kale's quarters. Using her security clearance, Zanara brought Kale to abandoned sections of the city where they could explore without surveillance. In one such area, she showed him ancient murals depicting Zorathians dancing, embracing, and celebrating in ways now forbidden. My research suggests a correlation between the suppression of sensory pleasure and declining innovation rates, Zanara explained, tracing the faded images. Creativity requires inefficiency, the exploration of unlikely possibilities. That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me, Kale teased, though he meant it more than she could know. As weeks passed, Kale noticed Zanara changing subtly. Her movements became more fluid, less mechanical. She occasionally used Earth idioms. Once, he even caught her humming a Beatles song he'd played. More alarming, rumors circulated about the High Counselor's daughter acting irregularly. Vyarwanan warned Kale that his Earth mannerisms were excessively influential and reminded him that cultural contamination was a serious offense. Kale knew they should stop. The risk grew daily. Yet every moment with Zanara felt more valuable than his own safety. The tipping point came during their 19th session. Kale had introduced Zanara to Earth dance music, specifically disco, which she found rhythmically optimal. They spun around his quarters, laughing as Kale taught her the hustle. Your civilization rejected this art form, Zanara asked incredulously, executing a perfect spin. The 70s were complicated, Kale laughed. They were dancing closer now, Kale guiding her through more partner-focused moves. The proximity was intoxicating. Her scent reminded him of something like cinnamon and ozone, distinctly alien yet increasingly familiar. Suddenly, Zanara stopped dancing. Kale, she said with uncharacteristic directness, in my research of Earth customs, I encountered a practice I found particularly interesting. What's that? Kale asked, still holding her hand from their dance. A gesture called kissing, she said quietly. Is it true humans press their mouths together as a sign of affection? Kale swallowed hard. Yes, that's accurate. The files classified it as a primitive biological bonding mechanism, Zanara continued, stepping closer. But I suspect there's more to it. There definitely is, Kale managed, acutely aware of how close she stood. I would like to experience this custom, Zanara said, her scientific tone belied by the intensity in her eyes. For comparative cultural understanding. Before Kale could formulate a proper response, something about protocol violations and cultural boundaries and all the reasons this was a spectacularly bad idea, Zanara leaned forward awkwardly, her lips meeting his in a clumsy but earnest first kiss. Time suspended. The universe contracted to the single point where their lips connected. Kale had kissed women before, but nothing like this, a kiss across species, across worldviews, across everything that should have kept them apart. Zanara pulled back slightly, eyes questioning. Was that correctly executed? My research materials were limited. Kale laughed softly. It was perfect, he whispered, leaning in to show her a slightly different approach. Their second kiss deepened, Zanara learning with her typical rapid precision. Kale's hands found her waist, pulling her closer as her fingers tentatively explored his hair. The searing blast of the door alarm shattered the moment. The door alarm blared, its sharp, mechanical tone slicing through the intimate moment like a blade. Kale and Zanara sprang apart, their breaths ragged, eyes wide with panic. The door hissed open, revealing VRYNN and two security officers, their expressions as cold and unyielding as the Zorathian architecture. Engineer Kale, VRYNN said, his voice devoid of emotion, you are in violation of Zorathian Protocol 47B, unauthorized cultural contamination. You will come with us immediately. Zanara stepped forward, her posture rigid but her voice trembling slightly, this is a misunderstanding. I authorized this interaction for diplomatic research purposes. VRYNN's gaze shifted to her, his eyes narrowing, High Counselor Zanara, your involvement complicates matters. You will report to the Council for disciplinary review. Kale's mind raced. He knew the consequences of their actions, exile, imprisonment, or worse. But as he glanced at Zanara, he saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before, defiance. This isn't contamination, Kale said, stepping forward. It's connection. Zanara and I. Silence, VRYNN interrupted. Your primitive emotions have no place here. Zanara's hands clenched into fists. You speak of efficiency, VRYNN, but what of progress? What of evolution? Kale has shown me that our society's rejection of emotion has stunted our growth. We've become machines, not beings. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Even the security officers seemed to hesitate, their programmed loyalty conflicting with the truth in Zanara's voice. VRYNN's expression hardened, your words border on treason, Zanara. You will both be detained until the council decides your fate. As the officers moved to restrain them, Kale made a split-second decision. He grabbed Zanara's hand and bolted for the door, shoving past the officers with a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength. Run, he shouted, pulling Zanara down the corridor. They sprinted through the sterile halls, alarms blaring behind them. Zanara's training kicked in, her movements precise and efficient as she led Kale through a maze of maintenance tunnels and service elevators. Where are we going? Kale panted, struggling to keep up. To the old city, Zanara replied, her voice steady despite the chaos. It's abandoned. They won't think to look for us there. They emerged into a crumbling section of the city, its once grand structures now overgrown with bioluminescent vines. The air was thick with the scent of decay and forgotten memories. This is where our ancestors lived, Zanara said, her voice tinged with sadness. Before the Great Rationalization, this was a place of art, music, and celebration. Kale looked around, awestruck. It's beautiful. It's a reminder of what we've lost, Zanara replied, turning to face him, and what we could regain, if we're brave enough. Kale reached for her hand, his heart pounding. Zanara, I. Don't, she interrupted, her eyes glistening. Not yet. We're not safe. As if on cue, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the ruins. Kale and Zanara exchanged a glance, their unspoken bond stronger than ever. Ready to run again? Kale asked, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. Zanara nodded, her expression resolute. Always. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the crumbling ruins of the old city. Kale and Zanara pressed themselves against a moss-covered wall, their breaths shallow and synchronized. The faint glow of bioluminescent vines cast eerie shadows across their faces, illuminating the tension in their expressions. "They're close," Zanara whispered, her voice barely audible. "We need to move." Kale nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He tightened his grip on her hand, feeling the coolness of her skin against his. "Where to?" "Follow me," she replied, her eyes scanning the dimly lit ruins. She led him through a narrow passageway, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of moss underfoot. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, a stark contrast to the sterile environment of the modern Zorathian city. As they navigated the labyrinthine ruins, Zanara's movements were precise and deliberate, a testament to her training. Kale, on the other hand, struggled to keep up, his human stamina no match for her Zorathian efficiency. "How do you know your way around here?" Kale asked between breaths. "I've studied the old city extensively," Zanara replied, her voice steady. "It's a part of our history that's been erased, but not forgotten." They emerged into a large, open courtyard, its once grand fountain now a crumbling relic. The sound of water trickling through the cracks in the stone added a haunting melody to the otherwise silent ruins. "This was a place of celebration," Zanara said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "Our ancestors would gather here to dance, sing, and share stories." Kale looked around, his eyes wide with wonder. "It's incredible. I can almost hear the music." Zanara smiled faintly, a rare expression of emotion. Perhaps one day, it will be filled with life again. Their moment of respite was short-lived. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the courtyard, growing louder with each passing second. "We need to keep moving," Zanara said, her tone urgent. "Wait," Kale said, his eyes narrowing as he spotted something glinting in the dim light. He approached the fountain, reaching into the murky water to retrieve a small, metallic object. "What is it?" Zanara asked, her curiosity piqued. Kale held up the object, his eyes widening in recognition. "It's a data crystal. Old Earth technology. But what's it doing here?" Zanara's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "That's impossible. Earth technology shouldn't exist on Zorath. Unless someone brought it here," Kale said, his mind racing. "Someone from Earth." The sound of footsteps grew louder, snapping them back to reality. Zanara grabbed Kale's hand, pulling him towards a hidden passageway. "We need to go. Now." They slipped into the passageway just as a group of security officers entered the courtyard. The officers' voices echoed through the ruins, their words sharp and commanding. "Search the area. They can't have gone far." Kale and Zanara moved silently through the passageway, their breaths shallow and synchronized. The narrow corridor was lined with ancient carvings, their intricate designs telling stories of a time long forgotten. "Where does this lead?" Kale whispered, his voice barely audible. "To the heart of the old city," Zanara replied. "A place where the council's influence doesn't reach." They emerged into a vast chamber, its walls adorned with vibrant murals depicting scenes of celebration and unity. The air was thick with the scent of incense, a remnant of the rituals once performed here. "This is incredible," Kale said, his eyes wide with awe. "It's like stepping into another world." "It is another world," Zanara replied, her voice tinged with sadness. "A world that was lost to us." Kale turned to her, his expression serious. "We can bring it back, Zanara. We can show your people what they've been missing." Zanara's eyes met his, a flicker of hope shining through. "It won't be easy. The council will stop at nothing to maintain control." "Then we'll have to be smarter than them," Kale said, a determined glint in his eyes, starting with this. He held up the data crystal, its surface glinting in the dim light. If this is what I think it is, it could change everything. Zanara's brow furrowed. What do you mean? This crystal contains information, secrets that the Council has been hiding. If we can access it, we can expose the truth. Zanara's eyes widened in realization. You're talking about rebellion. I'm talking about freedom, Kale replied, his voice steady, for you, for your people, and for us. The sound of footsteps echoed through the chamber, snapping them back to reality. Zanara grabbed Kale's hand, her grip firm. We need to go. Now. They moved quickly through the chamber, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust underfoot. The murals seemed to come alive as they passed, their vibrant colors telling stories of a time when Zorith was a place of joy and connection. As they reached the far end of the chamber, Zanara paused, her eyes scanning the wall for something. Here, she said, pressing her hand against a hidden panel. The wall slid open, revealing a narrow staircase leading downward. The air was cool and damp, a stark contrast to the warmth of the chamber. Where does this lead? Kale asked, his voice filled with curiosity. To the archives, Zanara replied, her tone serious. If there's any information that can help us, it will be there. They descended the staircase, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the narrow passageway. The air grew colder with each step, the walls lined with ancient carvings that seemed to watch them as they passed. At the bottom of the staircase, they emerged into a vast, dimly lit room filled with rows of ancient data crystals. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, a testament to the years of neglect. This is it, Zanara said, her voice filled with awe. The lost archives. Kale's eyes widened as he took in the sight. This is incredible. There's so much history here. History that the Council has tried to erase, Zanara replied, her tone bitter, but we can use it to bring the truth to light. They moved quickly through the archives, their eyes scanning the rows of data crystals for anything that could help them. Kale's heart raced as he spotted a terminal in the corner of the room, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. Over here, he said, his voice filled with excitement. Zanara followed him to the terminal, her eyes narrowing as she examined the ancient technology. This is old, even by Zorathian standards. But it should still work. Kale inserted the data crystal into the terminal, his hands trembling with anticipation. The screen flickered to life, its glow casting in. The escape. The terminal screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow across the dimly lit archives. Kale's fingers flew across the ancient interface, his heart racing as he decrypted the data crystal. Zanara stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the screen, her expression a mix of hope and apprehension. This is it, Kale muttered, his voice tense. This crystal contains records of the Council's experiments, proof that they've been suppressing emotions and creativity to maintain control. Zanara's eyes widened. If we can expose this, the people will rise against them. Exactly, Kale said, his voice firm, but we need to get this information out of here. Fast. The sound of footsteps echoed through the archives, growing louder with each passing second. Kale and Zanara exchanged a glance, their unspoken bond stronger than ever. They found us, Zanara whispered. Then we run, Kale replied, pulling the data crystal from the terminal. Where's the nearest exit? Zanara's eyes darted around the room, her mind racing. There's a hidden passageway behind the third row of shelves. It leads to the surface. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust. The sound of voices grew louder, the Council's security forces closing in. Stop. You're under arrest, a voice boomed through the archives. Kale and Zanara didn't look back. They reached the hidden passageway, slipping through just as the security forces entered the room. The narrow corridor was dark and damp, the walls lined with ancient carvings that seemed to watch them as they ran. Where does this lead? Kale asked, his voice strained. To the outskirts of the city, Zanara replied. We can lose them there. They emerged into the cool night air, the city's towering spires silhouetted against the starry sky. The sound of alarms echoed in the distance, the council's forces scrambling to find them. "We need a ship," Kale said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Something fast." "There's a docking bay nearby," Zanara replied, her voice steady. "But it's heavily guarded." "Then we'll have to be quick," Kale said, a determined glint in his eyes. They moved swiftly through the shadows, their movements synchronized. The docking bay came into view, its entrance guarded by 2 armed officers. "Stay here," Zanara whispered, her voice barely audible. Before Kale could protest, she stepped into the light, her posture rigid and authoritative. "Stand down," she commanded, her voice sharp. "I am High Counselor Zanara, and I order you to let us pass." The officers hesitated, their loyalty to the council conflicting with their respect for her rank. In that moment of hesitation, Kale struck, disarming one officer while Zanara incapacitated the other. "Let's go," Kale said, grabbing Zanara's hand. They sprinted into the docking bay, their eyes scanning the rows of ships. Kale's heart raced as he spotted a small, sleek vessel near the back. "That one," he said, pointing. They boarded the ship, Kale's hands flying across the controls as he powered up the engines. The ship hummed to life, its thrusters glowing with a soft blue light. "Hold on," Kale said, his voice tense. The ship shot forward, breaking through the docking bay doors and into the open sky. The city's defenses sprang to life, their lasers narrowly missing the ship as Kale maneuvered through the chaos. "We're not out of this yet," Zanara said, her eyes fixed on the radar. "They're sending fighters after us." "Then we'll have to lose them," Kale replied, his voice steady. He pushed the ship to its limits, weaving through asteroids and debris as the fighters closed in. Zanara's hands flew across the co-pilot's console, rerouting power to the shields and weapons. "We can't outrun them forever," she said, her voice tense. "We don't have to," Kale replied, a determined glint in his eyes. "We just have to get to the jump point." The ship shuddered as a laser grazed its hull, the alarms blaring. Kale's hands tightened on the controls, his focus unwavering. "Almost there," he muttered. The jump point came into view, its swirling vortex of energy a beacon of hope. Kale pushed the ship forward, the fighters hot on their tail. "Brace yourself," he said, his voice tense. The ship plunged into the jump point, the world around them dissolving into a blur of light and color. When they emerged on the other side, the fighters were gone, the stars stretching out before them in an endless sea of possibilities. "We made it," Zanara said, her voice filled with relief. "We're not done yet," Kale replied, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "We have to get this information to Earth. It's the only way to stop the Council." Zanara nodded, her expression resolute. "Then let's go home."